actually, when I was first told about Michael Hines, Tim O'Mara back at Notre Dame just said that he was sui generis, was his way of having described Michael. Michael did teach at Notre Dame for some time. He is a theologian, a priest, one-time seminary dean, and has worked a great deal with his brother Kenneth Hines, a Franciscan priest. They have a fine book called The Fullness of Faith on Public Theology, and it's published a few years ago. You have an article in your book of readings that I know some of the mentors, they starred that book. That is something that I'm asking people to do that. What I've asked Michael to talk about is a continuation of where we started last night at this feast, the theme of sacramentality or an incarnational theology, finding God in all things. And I'll let Michael start and talk. I'll talk less so he can talk more. Thanks, Michael.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me tell you what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what it is that I think, at least, makes Catholicism Catholicism. There are, after all, lots of ways of being Christian. There's the enormously rich Orthodox traditions. There's the Anglican tradition. There's the Lutheran tradition. There are the Reformed traditions. There are the evangelical traditions, all of which have marvelously wise, insightful, powerful, important things to say about the Christian tradition. There's also the Catholic tradition. What has Catholicism to say about Christianity? What makes Catholicism Catholicism? And I'm going to suggest to you that more than any other single element, it is the sacramental principle. And by the sacramental principle, what I mean is, and this is a kind of provisional statement of it, I'll be back to explain this much more as we go. The sacramental principle is that which is always and everywhere the case must be noticed, accepted, and celebrated somewhere, sometime. What is always and everywhere true, what is always and everywhere the case, must be noticed and accepted or rejected and celebrated somewhere, sometime. You have to concretize what is always and everywhere the case. Now, let me explain, let me give you some background, and then I hope it becomes apparent why I think that's so important. What I'm going to ask you to do is to think with me about the question for just a moment that Martin Heidegger maintained was the beginning of all metaphysics. Why is there being rather than nothing? And the Christian tradition's answer to that, there are many ways that one would attempt to answer that. The Christian tradition's way of answering that is because it's loved. The reason there is something rather than nothing is because it is the object of love. All things that are loved into being. That indeed, the only reason there is anything is because it is called into being because God loves it. Now, why is that so important to say? It's important for a couple of reasons. One, if God is God, if God, the handy-dandy bit of theological shorthand that we use to describe the mystery which grounds and undergirds all that exists, if that mystery which grounds and surrounds all that exists, call it God. We want to call it something else, we can call it something else, but God's handy, it's short, it's 3 letters, it's one syllable, it's been around a while, standard terminology. So we'll call it God. If God is God, absolute mystery, if God is utterly complete in God's self, if God needs nothing else, then we cannot talk about creation existing because of what it gives God. You know, now that I teach, I used to teach for a number of years at Notre Dame, and now I teach at Boston College, and the Jesuit motto is ad maiorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God. And I tell my Jesuit friends and colleagues that while that may have great power as an ethical statement, as a theological statement, it's deeply wanting. Because, in fact, you see, God doesn't need great glory. God's got tons of glory. God God that God is great. God presumably has noticed. God does not need creatures to glorify God. God's already glorified. Why does anything other than God exist at all? Not so that it can give something to God, but so that God can give something to it. Creation exists as the recipient of a gift. What is it that God, that ultimate mystery, gives to creation? Well, there are only two possibilities. Either God gives something other than God, but that's just more creature, or God gives God. The creation exists so that God can give God's self to it. Creation exists so that God can communicate God's self to creation. Creation exists because it's the object of love, the only ground for its existence. Now, so deep is that in the Christian tradition, that the Christian tradition actually insists that it's the restored way to understand what we mean by this mystery which grounds and surrounds all that exists. I like to tell my starting students in theology that theology is always done, any theological tradition, certainly the Christian theological tradition, is always done between two, as it were, signposts, two poles. One pole is probably best summed up, most famously summed up by Ludwig Wittgenstein. Of course, is one of the names to conjure with in the history of philosophy in the 20th century. Wittgenstein ends the last proposition of Wittgenstein, the only book published by Wittgenstein during his lifetime, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. You probably have seen the film. The last proposition, arguably the most often quoted single sentence in 20th century philosophy, is of that about which we can say nothing, let us be silent. In other words, if you don't know what you're talking about, shut up. Of that about which we can say nothing, let us be silent. That's an enormously important religious counsel as well. That if God is sovereignly mystery, then let us not natter on about God like we know what we're talking about. That too often the problem with religious language and religious imagery is that we present it too confidently. We present it as if, you see, it's perfectly clear what we're talking about. Well, if it's perfectly clear, you're wrong. Because what we're dealing with is ultimate mystery. And whatever one does, one cannot lose the reality, the deep sense of that mystery which undergirds all that exists. You remember the first commandment of the Decalogue in both Exodus and in Deuteronomy is not to make any graven image of God. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no strange gods before me. You shall make no graven images of me. Well, that's actually an enormously important religious commandment. Because what it counsels against is the too easy idolatry of religious language. You see, we all make images of God. I'm talking about God now for a few moments. Not one of you, at least to my notice, has turned to the person next to you and said, have you spelled it? What's he talking about? What does the word mean? When I say the word God, something goes on in your head. However wonderful that is, however deep, rich, powerful, marvelous, however philosophically grounded, however metaphysically precise, however epistemologically accurate, however traditionally grounded, however scripturally sound, however magisterially orthodox, it's not God. That's the most important thing to know. That what you've got in your head when you say the word God is an image of God, and the first commandment is don't make images. So you have to be very cautious about not confusing what you think of when you hear the word God with God. That if Wittgenstein is right, the first thing we should know about trying to talk about God is it's a very dangerous business. The second commandment, of course, flows right from the first. You remember the second commandment is, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Now, of course, we've done, at least within the Catholic tradition, but I think within the Christian tradition generally, we've done terrible things to that. We've belittled it into a sort of commandment against profanity. Don't use bad language. Now, if anybody asks you, I'm opposed to bad language. If anybody says, to what position did Hines take on profanity? He's against it. However, I assure you that Moses had more on his mind at Sinai than how colorfully the Israelites were swearing at the foot of the hill. It's not about profanity. It flows out of the first commandment. You see, it means quite exactly what it is. Do not take the name of God in vain. Don't go shattering on about God in vain. Don't go talking about God like you know what you're talking about. See, it's not a commandment against profanity, it's a warning against theology. It's a warning against preaching. Be very, very, very cautious about how you use the word God. Because much more often than not, you're going to be using it in vain. If we're talking about mystery, don't natter on about mystery like you know what you're talking about. So, Wittgenstein's portion is immensely important. However, it has to be balanced by another pole. And that other pole I borrowed from T.S. Eliot, talking about poetry, but I think I can use it without bending it very much at all to talk about religious language. Eliot says that there are some things about which we can say nothing, and before which we dare not keep silent. That there are some things about which we know in advance whatever we say will be inadequate. It can't be said right. But these issues are so important, so crucial, that you dare not say nothing. If I may use an image taken from a Woody Allen film. I'm a New Yorker by origin, not Grand Glorious Diocese of Brooklyn. That's where I was ordained. And all New Yorkers have an immediate affinity with Woody Allen films. Elsewhere in the country, people think Woody Allen makes comedies. New Yorkers know that Woody Allen makes documentaries. Allen sets up a camera on the Upper West Side, films what's going on, the rest of the world thinks it's funny. New Yorkers know his life. About 20 years ago now, one of his films, I think one of the most beautifully filmed of his movies, is a film called Manhattan. And in it, he plays a man who is deeply in love with a young woman, played in the film by Ariel Hemingway, who hasn't a clue that this man is romantically attracted to her at all. She just thinks of him as a really good friend. And she hasn't any clue at all that he is absolutely pining for her. And throughout the film, and he keeps trying to work his way up to have the nerve to tell her how he feels about her. And finally, about 2/3 of the way, 3/4 of the way into the film, in the midst of a conversation about something utterly remote from this, he simply can't stand it anymore, or he blurts out, "I love you," and instantly catches himself says, no, I don't. I love you. No, I But he goes through about 12 different ways of saying exactly those same 3 words. Why? Because the point of the scene is, the moment you say them, you know how hopelessly lame they sound. I mean, they are so cliche, they are so banal at this point. They've been so used and misused and overused in the English language that to say "I love you" doesn't begin to say what this man wants to say to that woman. Now, well, Wittgenstein writing the script, Wittgenstein would have said, "End the film" at this point. See, if you can't say it, shut up. If you don't know how it can be said correctly, don't say it. But Eliot, with great wisdom, knows there are some things that are so important you dare not keep silent. You know that you can't say "I love you" correctly, but you know you can't shut up. You have to try and say this some way. There is that which is so important that one cannot be silent about it. you see, if we are talking about God, and remember, first and foremost, when we're talking about God, we're not talking about whether or not there is a great big fellow out there someplace, older, wiser, stronger than you and I are. And are we going to affirm its existence or not? That's not God, that's Zeus. And you baptize Zeus, but Zeus stays Zeus. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about God. First and foremost, when we talk about God, we are talking about the question, do you think there is meaning, purpose, and direction to your life? And do you think that you're not the one who decides it? That question, whether you answer it yes or no, is the question about God. Do you think there is meaning, purpose, and direction to your life, and that you are not the sole source of that meaning, purpose, and direction? That you discover meaning, you don't only create meaning for your life. How to answer that question is how to answer the God question. There is no way to simply say, well, that's an enormously difficult question. It's enormously tough to get a handle on it. There's no final, adequate, sufficient answer to the question. Therefore, I simply won't ask it. Well, you can't not ask that question, implicitly or explicitly. Ask, and try to respond to the question, do you think there's meaning and purpose in your life? Do you think you are the creator solely of meaning and purpose in your life? You can't answer it finally, but it's too important not to try and answer it some way. That's where theology gets done. That's where all religious language gets carried on. Is there some way of talking about God that is less hopelessly inadequate than all other ways of talking about God? Well, the Christian tradition says yes, there is. There's a kind of fundamental metaphor for talking about God. After all, I'm sure there are people whose expertise is English and literature, specifically poetry here, and therefore I say this with a certain amount of hesitation. But it seems to me that what you do in religious language is what all of the greatest users of language, poets, do. When you read what can't be said perfectly, you pile up metaphors. Now, we do that all the time. I mean, think of someone like Shakespeare. My favorite example for this is Act 5, Scene 5 of Macbeth. Act 5, Scene 5 of Macbeth, everything's falling apart. The English are getting closer. The Scottish rebel babes are getting closer. Macbeth's running around giving orders. There's a scream from off stage. Macbeth sends Seton, the steward, to find out what that cry was. Seton comes back a minute later and says, "The Queen, my lord, is dead." And Shakespeare does what Shakespeare always does when he's confronted by it at that moment. He tells you what we can't talk about it. Hamlet's "The rest is silence." Othello kills himself talking about something else. King Lear will dissolve into sound and rhythm. And what does Macbeth say? She should have died hereafter. There would have been time for such a word. There are no words for this. We can't talk about it. And then, of course, he does. And he launches into, you remember well, the great soliloquy, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And then you get that extraordinary moment where he says, life is. Now just keep in mind what the death of this woman means to that man. This is not only his wife. This is the only person who shares the guilt. This is the only other human being who knows all the horror. And she's gone. And he is now utterly alone. He's alone as few, if any, are ever alone. So now the loneliest human being in the world is going to tell you what life looks like. Life is. And what's he do? He piles up three metaphors. Life is a walking shadow. Now you got that walking shadow, nothing, absence of life. But think of animated nothingness, a walking shadow. You got that image? Keep that in mind. Come over to this angle with me. Life is also, from another angle, a poor player who struts and frets his hour above the stage and then it's heard no more. A bad actor, Shakespeare probably doing lots of them. Gets out there, flips the lines and bumps into the scenery and carried on. The audience just wants him to get off and get on with the play, and he gets off and you forget about it. Got that that in mind, come over to this angle. Look at it from this point of view. It's a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing. I don't know about you, I'm sure you have experienced this as teachers, but believe me, anybody who's spent 20 minutes in ministry knows what it's like to be buttonholed and told a tale full of sound and fury by an idiot. This terrible thing that I've been told, and get all done, and you say, now what is that about? I haven't a clue what it is about. The tale full of sound and fury signified nothing. You have those three experiences, draw out the lines, and where those three lines intersect, that's what life looks like to the lowliest human being who ever drew breath. But there's no way to say it. So you pile metaphor on metaphor on metaphor. Well, of course, it's not exactly what we do religiously. God is creator, God is judge, God is parent, God is spouse, God is shepherd, God is king, God is ruler, God is lawgiver, God is rock, God is general, God is leader in battle, God is savior, God is... We pile image on image on image on image on image, metaphor after metaphor after metaphor. Now, is there some foundational metaphor? It doesn't stop being a metaphor. It's not a definition. We're not going to say, this is what God is, and God is nothing but this. But we are going to say, this metaphor is so fundamental that all the other metaphors you use about God have to fit with it. Okay? Yes, there is. At least in the Christian tradition there is. I think in every tradition there is. But certainly in the Christian tradition. And the fundamental metaphor in the Christian tradition is all over the place in the New Testament, but it gets its clearest, sharpest, most succinct statement in one of the last documents of the New Testament collection, with what we call the first letter of John, chapter 4, verse 8, verse 16, God is love. But a very peculiar kind of love, agape. It's not the Greek word eros, which is perfectly wonderful and great and splendid and marvelous, but it's not the word chosen. Eros is a love that seeks satisfaction from the person or thing loved. So it includes erotic love, it includes sexuality, but it also, in English, when we use a statement like, I loved that movie. I loved playing tennis yesterday. I loved doing this. I loved doing that. That's erotic love. In Greek, you find it, you know how weird the Greeks are. It's erotic love in Greek in that you find satisfaction in the person or thing loved. Agape is not that. Agape is a love which is a pure gift of the lover to the beloved, to which satisfaction is irrelevant. The lover seeks nothing back from the beloved, not even gratitude. The lover loves simply because the lover gives the lover's self to the beloved. It is, therefore, often, when I'm teaching or writing about this, I prefer to translate agape rather than love, because it is such a catch-all term in English. I prefer to translate it as self-gift. It's the gift of the self to the other, asking nothing in response, not even thank you. It's the pure gift of self to the other. Notice, that's what the Christian tradition says is the least raw metaphor for talking about God. Now there's 100,000 things. The whole of the Christian tradition in many ways is an enormous expansion of that fundamental claim. For example, we could go into this at great length. You will be thrilled to know we won't. But one of the things to notice about that is, if one says the fundamental metaphor for God is agape, love, self-gift, isn't it interesting that love is not the name of a person, it's the name of a relationship among persons. So that we're saying, if you want to know the least wrong way, there is no right way, but the least wrong way to think about God, you will be least wrong if you understand God, that foundational mystery that grounds throughout all that exists, not first and foremost as person, but first and foremost as relationship. everybody say, well, this is all very bizarre. I've never heard this sort of stuff about Christianity, I've never heard this about Catholicism. I mean, where did we get this stuff? Well, in fact, within the Christian tradition, certainly within the Catholic form of the Christian tradition, we say it all the time. We say that we're doing and saying things in the name of the Father, of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That we're not claiming God is the one, we're claiming God is the relatedness of three. That God is least strongly thought of as a kind of relationship, an enormous explosion of love. Augustine, when he writes De Trinitate, he says, look, we've got this language in the New Testament. It's right there at the end of Matthew's Gospel. Go out and baptize all nations in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's fine. Father, Son, Spirit, nice, wonderful, scripturally sounds right there in the Bible. Isn't that wonderful? However, says Augustine, it's not the most helpful language of the world. And he sets out to see if he can find alternate sets of terms that might convey this better. He comes up with two sets that he particularly likes. I must confess, I particularly like. He says, perhaps better than Father, Son, Spirit would be giver, recipient, and gift given. Or, his alternative to that is, lover, beloved, and the love between them. That's what we're talking about when we talk about God. That for all eternity, God is endless self-gift, endless outpouring of self. From all eternity, God is endless acceptance of the gift of that outpouring and the rejoicing in it. And from all eternity, God is the outpouring. God is the lover, the beloved, and the love between them. The giver, the recipient, and the gift given. But when we talk about God, the mystery that surrounds all that exists, what we are talking about is this endless, eternal explosion of self-gift. That's what we're talking about. Which is why, you see, when we come to talk about creation within the Christian tradition, why does God create? Because God gets a kick out of it. Because God's like that. Because it's just overflowing love. The reason anything exists, anything, please notice, not just anyone. I'm not just talking about you and me. I'm talking about the chair you're sitting on. I'm talking about the pen you're holding. I'm talking about the leaves on the trees, your pet cat, your favorite rhododendron, the furthest supernova. I'm talking about everything that ever has, ever will, or can exist. Why does it exist rather than nothing? Why is there something rather than nothing in Heidegger's question? And the answer is, because it's loved. Now, what marks us, human beings, is that we are a point in that creation that can acknowledge and either accept or reject being loved. We can like it or disregard it. We can turn away from it or embrace it. We can recognize the fact of it. The podium can't. But the podium is every bit as much loved as I am. See, that's the other thing to notice, is that the whole thing is loved perfectly. It's all loved perfectly, because you see, if you're God, you can't do it less than perfectly. I mean, God is God, and therefore does everything like God. That is to say, God does everything perfectly. God doesn't love a little bit, and a little bit more tomorrow, and a little bit less. God really loved you on Tuesday, but Wednesday, well, you weren't as good on Wednesday, so God loved you a little less. But Thursday morning, you repented. God's nuts about you again Thursday afternoon. I mean, that's pure mythology. We're back to Zeus or Odin. God loves everything like God. That is to say, perfectly, completely, 100%. Not anything else can accept being loved 100%. But God loves 100%. The gift is given totally. So how much is the podium loved? Perfectly. How much is Heinz loved? Perfectly. What's the difference? Heinz knows it. And the podium doesn't. And sometimes Heinz accepts it. Now and again. It also means that I sometimes use this image when I'm preaching about this because it ruffles Catholic feathers, which of course is an excellent thing to do in the pulpit. Because after all, most homilies lull Catholic sensibilities, so now and again it's a good thing to ruffle them up. Is I like to say, look, what we're saying is, if I dare put it this way, from God's point of view, if I dare say that for a moment, from God's point of view, there is no difference between the Blessed Mother and Satan. God loves them both perfectly. The difference is Mary's thrilled and Satan hates it. But that's on their side, not God's. There's nothing you can do to make God not love you. If there were, you would be more powerful than God. You could make God change. The fact is, you are absolutely, totally, 100% loved all the time. Everything is. Let me try out a good classical source for that, namely Thomas Aquinas. You know, I mean, as a Catholic, whenever you speak theologically, throw in St. Thomas, it makes everybody feel good, you know. Oh, that's great. Now we don't get the real stuff. It's Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas, in this shorter of the two Summae, St. Thomas says, you know, I forgot to put this on, or it's just gone awful. I think it's Thomas Aquinas protesting. Thank you. Thomas wrote two Summae, the shorter of the two Summaes, the Summa Contra Gentiles. In book 4 of the Summa Contra Gentiles, Thomas asks a question. If God is everywhere, is God in hell? And Thomas's answer to the question is, yes, God is. And then, of course, with his typically ruthless logic, Thomas asks the next obvious question, and what is God doing there? And Thomas's answer is, God is in hell, loving the damned. The damned may not love God, but the damned can't make God stop loving them. See, the opposite of being loved by God is not damnation. The opposite of being loved by God is not being. Not to be loved by God is not to be. Everything that is, to the extent that it is loved. Now, if that's true, if we buy that for perspective, just for argument's sake for a moment, there is a difficulty. And the difficulty is, and here you notice we start edging back toward the sacramental principle. If love is omnipresent, if love is all over the place, if everything is loved, and there is, by the way, I should point out, another bit of handy theological shorthand for this. What do you call the agape of God outside the Trinity? The agape of God calling all things into being. There's a handy-dandy bit of theological shorthand for it. It's called grace. That's what you mean by the word grace in Christian theology. It's the self-love, the self-giving of God outside the Trinity. Well, if that's true, then the whole thing is awash in grace. It's all grace, from top to bottom, start to stern, end to stern. It's the whole thing is grace, complete, entire, total. It's all in grace all the time. But if that's true, then it may go unnoticed. Because what is omnipresent is more often than not unnoticed. For example, since I began speaking, all of you have been blinking. Now, unless this has been preternaturally boring, you haven't been counting your blinks. I'm always a little reluctant to use that example. There's something at the back there that would say 5,619. But we don't think about blinking. This particular example occurred to me a couple of years ago because I got hit with about Bell's palsy and everything on the left side of my face froze, and I couldn't blink. I had to periodically throughout the day hold this eyelid down and take it down at night. Everyone on that side of the room thought I was being fresh with them all the time. I can tell you, don't flatter yourselves. But it also, by the way, was a terrible handicap because it meant that I could only speak with the right side of my mouth. And that's desperately damaging professional handicap, since we know by definition theologians speak out of both sides of their mouth. So it's great harm can be done to your career by if I don't palsy if you're a theologian. But in any event, if you can't blink, you become very conscious of blinking. All of a sudden, it's a big issue, the fact that you can't blink. We never think about it until something like Bell's palsy draws our attention to it. What you do all the time, nobody thinks about. What is always there, nobody pays attention to. You never think about the oxygen in a room until the oxygen starts to go stale in the room. Your heart beats all the time. You don't think about your heart beating. We would notice if it didn't as you slumped to the floor, but but normally you don't pay attention to that. And if grace is omnipresent, then grace is clearly going to be ignored. What is always present tends not to be noticed. There have to be occasions when grace is called to our attention, when it is concretized, when that which is always the case is made so present that we cannot help but notice it, accept it or reject it, and if we accept it, celebrate it. What do you call those moments? You call them sacraments in the Catholic tradition. Now, I'm not talking just about the 7 great public rituals that Catholics celebrate. By sacrament, I mean any person, place, thing, or event, any sight, sound, taste, touch, or smell that gets you to notice the love which undergirds all that exists. The love which undergirds your being and the being of everything about you. What are those moments when you see, first of all, how many are there? Potentially, they are virtually infinite. How many things exist in the universe? There is nothing that cannot be a sacrament. Absolutely nothing. Even, St. Augustine might point out, sin. In the context of repentance, sin can become a moment when you discover how deeply loved you are, that even in spite of this, you are forgiven. There's nothing that cannot become a sacrament. Absolutely nothing. We all have our personal sacraments. I would trust, all of those of you who are married, I would trust that one of the deepest, richest, most profound experiences of the fundamental love which undergirds being is your spouse. Those of you who are parents, it's your children. To your next door neighbors, they're the pests next door. To you, they're sacraments. The fact is that we all have our own private, personal array of sacraments. They're absolutely necessary. Just to make an allusion to last evening, that's what's going on at the Dead Feast. I mean, did you notice in the film, did you notice in the film how we move from an insistence on the centrality of word at the beginning of the film, and you have a few crackers and some really ghastly looking soup, to the end of the film, where you don't talk about God at all, but wow, you really taste that wine. You really appreciate this food. And you notice the stars at the end. Very good moment. I'll be back to that business of noticing the stars at the end of the film. This is why, you see, this is why Catholic liturgy looks the way it looks. You can use anything. The fundamental principle of Catholic liturgy is everything on the kitchen sink. Why? Because there's nothing that is not potentially sacred. It's all embraced. So what do you like? You like singing, we sing. You like dancing, we dance. You like parades, we march in, we march out. We wave banners, we ring bells, we play organs, we blow horns, we sound trumpets. If you like eating, we give you something to eat, something to drink, we pour water on you, we put you to bed when you get married, we pour oil on you. You have a strong sense of smell, we pour incense at you. Visually, you like paintings, mosaics, statues, big buildings, stained glass, you name it, the whole thing can get thrown in. Because none of it is by definition profane. All of it is potentially sacramental. So the whole thing can get used. There's a wonderful phrase to this from Gerard Manley Hopkins, the great 19th century English Jesuit poet. Hopkins, I'm sure you know this poem well because it's one of the most frequently anthologized of Hopkins' poems. It's entitled Hurrah in Harvest. So he's saying hurrah in harvest. Hopkins, and the situation of the poem is that Hopkins is teaching at this point in a Jesuit boys' school in Wales. And it's harvest time, it's the fall. And so the summer's gone, the winter's not quite there yet, and Hopkins, presumably coming home from the school to the Jesuit residence, but many of them walking God, he's got winter ahead of him, and if you've ever seen winter in Wales, and the fog lifts just enough to let you see the mud. He's kind of dreading the winter, and suddenly he starts to say to himself, well, wait a minute, look at the joy of these people bringing in the harvest. Look at the color of these leaves as they change. Look at the way these clouds scud across the sky, the way the wind blows off the Irish Sea at this time of year. How beautiful this is. Here I am, worrying about what's gone, and dreading what's not here, and not noticing what is here at the moment. And the next to last line of the poem is, in my opinion, the single most beautiful statement in English of the Catholic sacramental principle. Hopkins was Catholic to the tips of his fingers. I mean, just dripped Catholicism. Hopkins, the next to last line is, these things were here, and but the beholder wanted. You see, it's not that the leaves suddenly changed colors at that moment, or the sky suddenly changed. That was already going on. What's changed? Hopkins has changed. It was there. He wasn't a beholder. He's now learned to be a beholder and see what's there. You see, the whole of sacramental life in Catholicism is about training people to be beholders. It's an enormous pedagogy, Catholic liturgy, in trying to get people to see what's there, to behold what's in front of them, in the conviction that if you really see and appreciate fully what's in front of you, whether you use the language or not, you will be encountering grace. You will see the love which undergirds everything. That, you see, is of course what happens at the end of Tibet's feast, isn't it? They've all been inside the house, learning to appreciate what's in front of them, the taste, the smell, the aroma, the color of it. And then they go outside into that little square that they've been in 100,000 times. And they look up at the stars and begin to sing. And you remember that marvelous, marvelous line. One of the two most spectacular lines of both the story and the film. When the one sister says to the other, the stars look very close tonight. And the other sister says, maybe they are every night. Why is it that tonight we see what was always there? Because the dead has made you beholders. You have come to appreciate what's there in front of you. That's what sacramentality is supposed to be about. Now, what has all this to do with education? I suggest to you that if this is true, that anything that alerts, awakens, enlivens, expands the imagination, opens the vision, enriches the sensitivity of any human being is a religious act. It's all part of beholding sacramentally. Nobody may never use that language. If I may give you a favorite story of mine for this. Back at the very beginning of the century, 1901, it was back in Friedrich von Hugel, who is, I think, not I alone, certainly, but I certainly am one of the people who think one of the most profoundly Catholic people of the 20th century. Friedrich von Hugel, who, despite the very German-sounding name, was actually an Englishman. His father had been an Austrian baron, but his mother was a Scot. He was brought up in England. English was his first language, and so forth. Von Hugel was invited to give a talk to a Christian Students' Association at Oxford. And in his talk to this presumably very earnest body of young Christian students at Oxford back in 1901, he asked the question, who is the great example of asceticism, self-discipline, in the 19th century? Talking about asceticism, self-discipline is an important part of what spiritual growth. Who is the great example of this in the 19th century? The most striking example of this in the 19th century. And he answered his own question for them. His answer must have shocked those rather sober young Christian gentlemen in Oxford, considering that it's right at the end of the 19th century, the dawn of the 20th. He said, without question in his mind, the most important example of asceticism in the 19th century had been Charles Darwin. Because, says Van Hugel, here was someone who took this extraordinarily key, powerful intellect, this extraordinary energy, this extraordinary intellectual drive, and with immense discipline over a long period of time, subordinated it to the varieties of barnacles and the shapes of pigeons' bills. That what Darwin had done was to force himself with incredible clarity and intensity to observe what was there. That, says Van Hugel, is what self-discipline is had. Asceticism is not self-denial because somehow or other that pleases God who has a mildly sadistic streak. The whole point is that one disciplines oneself sufficiently so that one can begin to move beyond what one hopes, what one dreams, what one fears, what one wants, what one doesn't want, to what is in fact there. To see the reality, not only the reality shaped by my fears, my dreams, my hopes, my worries, etc., etc., etc. I like to say, to tell students, that the point of asceticism is to stop looking in the mirror long enough that you might get a chance to look out the window. To stop looking at yourself long enough that you see something else. And in the conviction, on the Christian, on the Catholic side, that if you genuinely see what's in front of you, you will be discovering the love which undergirds all that exists. You will discover the omnipresence of grace. So you may call it that. Well, where do people today learn that kind of self-discipline? Well, there are all sorts of ways life teaches us self-discipline. My God, marriage is a whopping good example. Parenthood is a fine example. Learning to pay the mortgage and pay off the credit cards are all wonderful examples of self-discipline, of coming to grips with what's there, not what you'd like to be there, or worry is there. But certainly, one of the ways is the sciences. This is why it seems to me there is a profoundly sacramental dimension to all of the sciences. Because they are all trainings in intellectual self-discipline. We even use that phrase, don't we? We call some of our fields disciplines. Well, we're not disciplining reality, we're disciplining us. That's what's getting disciplined in order to be able to enter into the field. Anything that expands the imagination, enriches the vision, liberates the will, frees the vision, disciplines the attention, or anything that does that is a profoundly religious act. Indeed, so convinced am I of this, that this would be a whole other angle of which to come at this, which I have not done today, but what we can come at it from the side of what we say about incarnation, that in fact God has become human, not acts human, not looks human, not pretends to be human, but God has chosen to be what we are. That humanity is what you and I and God share in common. If one maintains that, then how do you become like God? A very good handy-dandy description of sanctity. How do you become like God? You become like God by being as human as you can get. Because humanity is what you and God share in common if the incarnation is to be affirmed. And if that's true, then whatever opens the will and enriches the imagination, etc., is whether it makes you braver, wiser, stronger, more intelligent, more responsible, more loving, makes you more like God, makes you holy. And certainly, education is an enormously important part of that. That's why that's why Christianity got involved with education to start with. It's not because you got to teach them mathematics and maybe they'll sit through catechism. Bring them into the business school, but tell them they have to take theology for 6 credits. I mean, the point is, any field is ultimately religiously based if the whole thing rests on grace, if the whole thing rests on the self-giving of God. Because I want to leave opportunities for question, let me draw somewhat rapidly to a close. This sacramental conviction, more than anything else shapes Catholicism at its best. Now, I emphasize at its best. Catholicism is not always at its best. It was at its best for about 20 minutes one Tuesday afternoon in 986. I think granting the fact that that Catholicism does not live up to this all the time. But after all, if we were all going to command ourselves to live up to our very best all the time, which one of us would have not had to bed this morning? Because Catholicism is in fact always shaped by this sacramental vision. Because the Catholic tradition, at its wisest, at its best, is always shaped by the conviction that at the root of all of reality lies grace. Because that's true, the whole of what might be called the humanities, as well as the sciences, become religious fields. Let me give you a closing image. Canto 100 of Dante's Divine Comedy. Now, each of the Hell, Purgatory, Heaven have 33 cantos, and then you get the 100th to complete the and the last canto, Dante attempts to do what Wittgenstein would have told him he should have skipped, even making a stab at. Namely, he tries to give you the vision of God. If you remember, in the 99th canto, in the Paradiso, finally, he has reached the upper limit, the highest circle of heaven. Beatrice has led him to the highest circle of heaven, and she gestures for him toward Bernard of Clairvaux, who was kind of the symbol of everything that was richest and best in the spiritual tradition of the Christian community of the Middle Ages. And Dante says he gazed at Bernard with awe, but he realized Bernard is staring steadily across someone else, and he finally starts to follow Bernard's gaze, and there's Mary. And he says, well, he's just overwhelmed, he's overcome by the vision of Mary, until he realizes Mary is staring steadily upward. He follows Mary's glance, and there is the vision of God. End of Canto 99. Canto 100. He now can try to do the undoable. Needless to say, he fails. He just fails less badly than anybody else has ever failed, for my money. But that's because if you're not Dante, be Mozart. If you can't be either, it's all chopped liver right to the back. He says that there was a light that absolutely paralyzes his sight, blinds his sight. And as it burned his eyes, it healed them. So that he begins to realize the light is actually the interaction of 3 colors, 3 concentric globes of 3 colors, because he's thinking of the image of the Trinity. But as his eyes were more and more pained, but more and more strengthened by that burning, he could look into the very depth of the light, and in the light he saw Christian humanist tradition doesn't get better than this. I saw one exactly like myself. See, he sees the incarnation. I saw one exactly like myself, and then the great last line that the whole of the Divine Comedy has been leading us to. And then I knew the love that moves the sun and other stars. See, it's Dante's statement of the sacramental principle. The whole thing, the sun and all the stars, is all grounded and moved by love. It all exists because of endless self-gift. That's what needs to get sacramentalized. And the attempt to do that is what enlivens the Catholic tradition at its best. Thank you very much for your attention. do, but Tom does usually is to ask, are there any clarification questions first? So anything where you say, I don't know what, and if you do know what I meant, please tell me afterwards. If it was unclear, if you want something clarified, we get those questions taken care of first, and then any responses, comments, issues that you would like to raise, that I can comment on as you like it. Yes, I'm going to say I thought it's another triumph of pedagogy.
Yes, I don't know where to begin. I have so many notes here. I come from the Reformed tradition. I apologize for that up front. How would you handle, first of all, just a personal view. I always find it a bit problematic when we make God out to be such a complete and total mystery, because then I just simply have no idea what I'm believing in. What happens to reason? What happens to logos? It seems to me God, I mean, there's hesitation to think about God in a personal way. Creator, Savior. I mean, I think I can literally say that God is Creator and God is Savior. God almost becomes impersonal. It almost seems like we're moving very much in Eastern religious view, which, again, maybe that is ultimate reality, but it seems very different than perhaps the Christian tradition. And just two side notes. How would you handle the righteousness of God and how He hates sin? And would you subscribe to annihilationism? Is that the final place of, or the final state, if you will, of those who are somehow outside of the kingdom as you would understand the kingdom? I mean, it seems to me you subscribe to annihilationism.
No, I don't.
Okay, because, well, what did you mean then? A point of clarification.
It's good. I certainly agree with you. It looks like that first.
Right, because I mean, you said if blood isn't returned, then non-being is the result, and I assume that seemed to me pretty clear. Okay, I misunderstood there.
No, I possibly didn't think that more clear, but your question is an excellent one. You see, it's a question of, again, metaphorical language. You're quite right. If God did not reveal God's self in some way to us, then we have no way of knowing about God at all. Now, how does God reveal God's self to us? Preeminently, always as Logos, and the embodiment of Logos is Jesus of Nazareth in the Christian tradition. We'd all agree on that. But that Logos is not about all of creation. The whole of creation in some way, or the whole of creation exists because of the Word. It comes into being because of the Word. That's absolutely right. The problem is, how does one begin to grasp the Word? We do it only by way of metaphor. That the Word itself is what spurs us into thought. But our thinking is not simply an adequate mirror of what spurs us into thought. It's like encountering reality. I mean, there's all sorts of things we say about reality. We say things about reality all the time. But that does not mean we've adequately, fully, or in any, or even are capable of adequately or fully grasping the reality. You see, if one grasps the Logos, then one has comprehended the Logos, which makes the mind bigger than the Logos, so you're God.
If I could respond to that, I would simply say, I would respond by saying that to understand attributes of God, I can say God is the Creator, that's a word, but it refers to a concept that is ontologically true. God is the Creator, and so that word, it's inadequate. God is so much more, but I can apprehend God as the Creator, and I think that's perfectly reasonable, and I can understand God in that way. With that does not mean that I comprehended the totality, the mystery of God, but I mean, the thoughts we have, we think in terms of words and concepts, and those concepts can match up and very accurately describe the underlying reality, and they can be. And so, in that sense, there's great mystery without question, but I think it seems to me I'm not quite sure what I'm to believe in at all.
Well, that's another issue in terms of what the church believes in and what the church insists as being some ways of understanding God, of saying something about God which is true. Certainly possible to say things about God which are true, but that doesn't mean that you can say the truth about God.
I would disagree there. I mean, God is the creator. That is the truth about God.
Except if I ask you what creator is.
The creator of everything that we see.
Yeah, well, what is it? See, what I'm getting at is our notion of creator comes out of our understanding of the human experience of creation.
That's fine.
Yeah, but God is not a human creator. So whatever you mean when you use the word creation, which is a word describing a human experience, has to get stretched, pulled, expanded, used metaphorically when you talk about God. Otherwise, Mozart's a creator. Dante is a creator. God is a creator. But really, the word doesn't
God is
say
creator of the universe, all reality apart from the being that he or she is in himself. So I don't. It seems to me we can embrace reason and we can embrace the descriptions and the revelations we have of God and learn so much about God, and that we needn't feel frustrated even at a fundamental level that we can't understand God.
I think you're certainly correct, and I agree with you profoundly that we can say enormously important things about God, but we cannot finally say the adequate things about God. That all of our language is metaphorical, or as Thomas Aquinas would have said, analogical about God. But that literal statements about God are always false.
Okay, I have to agree to disagree with that point, obviously. Thank you so much, man.
But also, let me just mention your point about it. I hope that's all we need. Your point about annihilationism. No, it seems to me that it is perfectly possible that someone can refuse to be loved by God, refuse and deny the love of God forever. Because if we can, it seems to me, this is that question, sometimes students will say to me, I don't really believe in hell, I don't believe that God, and I said, no, look, hell is not something that God sends you to. Hell is what you embrace. Hell is the refusal to love God. It's being loved by God and refusing to accept being loved by God. Now, if that's the case, to say, I don't believe that someone can say no forever, is not a statement about the goodness of God, which is what they usually intended to be. It's a statement that you really don't believe in human freedom. That ultimately, when push comes to shove, ultimately, you're programmed to love back. And it seems to me that that's false. It's possible to say no forever. That's not annihilation. That's hell.
And we seem to be pretty statement about not returning to love. That's non-being, I think. What did you think about that?
But the point is, there is no such thing.
So ultimately, so it's universalist position that ultimately...
No, first of all, it's not that, I didn't say that not to love is not to be. I said not to accept being loved would not be not to be. See, if somebody, the person, not to be loved by God would be not to exist. Not to love God in response is hell. Your loving, your existence is not dependent on your loving. It's dependent on your being loved. And God, being God, does not change. So you are loved now and forever, and therefore you will exist. You may or may not love back. If you say no consistently forever, that's hell. That's not how being, that's hell.
So I get second chances. I always have the opportunity to turn things around.
Well, that I really don't know. That I think you have to allow that to God. Please.
I do want to ask sort of a related question, though, in a much different context. I was truly struck by when you articulated the sacramental principle in relation to liturgy, how you said, well, potentially anything could be used. And at least in practice, in my familiarity with debates on enculturation in India and Africa, very few things are used, and in the debate over what symbols and materials to use in the liturgy that would be appropriate in a particular context, the issue of truth does come to the fore, at least when it's raised by bishops and people in Rome. And the point is simply that there are certain symbols within a particular context that do not reflect the fullness of Christian truth, or have a potential to confuse people about Christian truth claims. And I wonder if you
confuse bishops.
Yeah, well, I'm a sure family member, I can't. But I wonder how you would apply your discussion of the sacramental principle to specific debates surrounding, say, liturgical adaptation, enculturation.
That's a wonderful question. There are certainly methods, for example, language, that you can't use as regards God in any way in which the language still makes any recognizable sense. That's why there's a fundamental metaphor, and that fundamental metaphor is agape. So, for example, could you say God is hatred? Well, no, I don't think you can, because that simply runs counter to the fundamental metaphor. Can you say God is evil? No, I don't think you can. That runs counter to the fundamental metaphor. So there would be certain ways of talking about God which would simply be ruled out, it seems to me. I think that's true. But certain things, I'd be much less, not ways of speaking, but things, I'd be much less quick to say. The class, as I'm sure you know, I would suspect from your reference to enculturation and liturgy, you're well familiar with this. There is in fact a classic case of this, and a horrifically dreadful case of this in Catholic history. It goes back to the 17th century, the so-called Chinese rites controversy, when Catholic missioners and teachers at work in China, most specifically Jesuit teachers, really were meeting with great encouragement and were embraced with great excitement by many people in China, and attempted to adapt elements of the Catholic liturgy to Chinese practices. For example, something like what the West calls ancestor worship, which the missioners quite clearly, quite correctly, I think, recognized, is not a question of worshiping God. It's not adoration. It's something much closer to what in Catholicism would be the veneration of the saints. It would be something like the communion of saints. On the other side of the world in Rome, that made no sense at all. And so it was simply perceived as watering down the faith. And so all adaptation was forbidden. The liturgy is to be celebrated exactly the same way in China as it's being celebrated in St. Peter's. And any adaptations are ruled out. It was just a disaster. It seems to me that we have to be very, very careful and very cautious. This has to do with that notion of discipline I was talking about. To find out, if I'm talking to you in your cultural context, when you do X, or handle Y, or say Z, what does that mean to you? Not what does it first suggest to me coming from my context, but what does it mean to you? And then one can begin to say, now there are ways in which this might be celebrated, and be able to celebrate the presence of grace. But that can only be done by careful, painstakingly careful attention to what the context in which these actions or realities are used and celebrated. Is that?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Just to not to press the issue too much, but just to clarify the issue. Say, for example, in India, if you wanted to have a picture of a particular Hindu saint or a particular Hindu god, would that cross the line then?
I don't think so. You could do what Catholicism has long done, just call it the Blessed Mother. I mean, we've got Black Madonna in Jehovah. We've got, Lady of Guadalupe, who clearly is not a young Jewish girl. She's clearly a young a young Native American woman. I mean, we've done that for centuries and centuries and centuries.
I guess this is more of a clarification point now that I have reflected on this a bit. And this goes back to when you were defining asceticism,
Yes.
where you talked about this, my recollections are dim already, my memory being what it is, as being, as not looking at yourself long enough to notice other things, not looking in the mirror
That's
long
right,
enough to see out the window.
not just to cloud, to cloud reality by one's own hopes, dreams, desires, fears, etc.
Fine. Yeah, because I had been wondering how that definition then related to what you had said in the article we read today about the importance of self-knowledge. It seems that the two things, if they weren't defined adequately, could contradict each other.
They certainly could. You're absolutely correct. However, one of the important things about self-knowledge is to find out where the self stops. And to know exactly where it is that I am projecting the self onto the external reality. That's exactly right. They can otherwise be very easily confused. Quite clear. I think this is something
That's my question. I was wondering, Dr. Hamilton, would comment on the passage, I think it's either in Ephesians or Colossians, which always struck me as profoundly intriguing and certainly embodying the sacramental nature of all creation, but with a very Christian focus. And that is when, I believe it's Paul says that he is the pattern and image of all things made. All things. Which sometimes I have found, if you present that, and I'm Protestant myself, but I've presented that to other Protestants and they back away from that. Like, that's there, that's in there.
It's in the scriptures. Reading it in a Catholic backs away from it too.
How would you relate that to what you're saying?
That's a wonderful question. And it's always seemed to me that that statement in the Pauline literature is very deeply related to the prologue to John's Gospel, that all things were made through him, and nothing was made except through him. What we are saying is, all creation exists to receive God's self-communication. It exists because it's loved. It exists as the object of God's self-gift. Is there some point in creation which is so perfectly, so absolutely, so utterly, so foundationally open to and accepting of God's self-communication that reality is the full embodiment of the gift as well as the full embodiment of receptivity to the gift? Yes, and what do we call that? We call that Christ. That Christ is the point in creation where the creature is everything the creature is supposed to be, namely, total recipient of God's self-gift, and receives that gift so utterly that God is that creature, not just a given to that creature. That's what we mean by incarnation, it seems to me. So, and therefore, it's a big question, but I'll say it as quickly as I can. It falls back onto two questions, as I'm sure you know. Two questions on how you place incarnation and redemption. It's often referred to as post-lapsarian and pre-lapsarian. Lapse there being referring to the fall. One way, and this is certainly the way that we hear, for example, classic statement of this is St. Anselm of Canterbury back at the end of the 11th century, has a profound effect on all of Catholic scholastic theology, has a profound effect on Reformation theology. It's the tradition that says, look, why is there an incarnation at all? Anson's book was, they were told, why a God man? Why a God human being? And his answer is because it is necessary in order to redeem, to atone for original sin. Presumably, therefore, Ansel doesn't ask this question, but presumably, no original sin, you don't need a God man. There's an alternative. That's the post-lapsarian view. The incarnation comes into the divine plan after the fall. There is a pre-lapsarian point of view, which you'll find in Ephesians, Colossians, and you find very strongly in John, which maintains that no, the effect of the incarnation is different because of the fall. But the incarnation is built into the logic of creation. That God calls creation into being precisely in order to unite God's self with creation. But the climax of that is the incarnation itself. And the example I like to use to talk about that is, I like to say, look, I have a niece and nephew. I'm going to leave each of them $1 million when I die, in their dreams. But that's already in the will. Now my nephew right now is 15. That's in the will. He's getting $1 million when I die. Uncle Michael doesn't die for another 30 years. 30 years from now, my nephew, who's married, has several children, and has lost his job. It's a point at which we're in a down cycle of the economy. He's at the point of losing his house. The mortgage is about to be foreclosed. He gets word, Uncle Michael's died and left you $1 million. How does he experience being left $1 million? Redemption. Salvation. Uncle Michael didn't leave him $1 million to save his mortgage. He was getting $1 million whatever happened. Given the context he's in fact in, he experiences it as salvation. From the foreclosure of the mortgage. But Uncle Michael was giving him $1 million simply because Uncle Michael was crazy about his nephew. Well, the same thing is true about incarnation. God is giving God's self to God's creatures because that's what God's like. Given the fact that God's creatures have sinned, God's creatures will experience it as redemption. But redemption isn't the original motive. The original motive is the only motive for God's action, namely agape. Okay? That helpful? I think we should. I'm running over time. Thank you very much. What a big pleasure.
There'll be time in small groups, which are what come next, to sort of talk about what it means to bring that sacramental ideal into all kinds of different things, the work that you do. I'm hoping Michael can join with one of those groups, so to be here for people to talk to. We will stay on schedule and meet at 5 o'clock in the chapel for the retreat and reflection. So or spirituality and reflection session. You're welcome to take a break, get some more soda, whatever's left there, and then
It's all refreshed. It's all refreshed.
it's all refreshed this evening.